Keanu Reeves has always been a different kind of movie star. While many actors in Hollywood travel with huge groups of people and hide behind dark sunglasses, Keanu often tries to live like a normal person. He rides the subway, he eats at simple diners, and he is known for being incredibly kind to everyone he meets. But despite his desire for a simple life, his face is too famous. Everywhere he goes, people recognize him immediately. They want photos, autographs, or just a moment of his time. This makes it almost impossible for him to have a genuine interaction with a stranger without his fame getting in the way. Recently, Keanu decided he wanted to change that. He didn't want to be Keanu Reeves the movie star for a while. He wanted to see how people would treat him if he was just a regular guy. This wasn't for a movie role, and it wasn't to make fun of anyone. It was a personal experiment to feel human again. He wanted to know if people could still connect with him if he had no money, no fame, and no special status. So, a plan was made. It was risky and a little bit crazy, but Keanu was determined to go through with it. The preparation took place in a quiet, dusty trailer parked on the outskirts of a busy city. Inside, a team of Hollywood makeup artists was waiting. When Keanu walked in, he wasn't wearing a suit or expensive leather. He was just wearing a t-shirt and jeans. He sat down in the makeup chair, looking a bit nervous but excited. The goal was to transform him completely. They needed to hide his sharp jawline, his sad eyes, and that specific look that everyone knows from The Matrix and John Wick. For hours, the artists worked carefully. They applied special glue to his face and added pieces of rubber to change the shape of his chin and his nose. They grayed his hair and gave him a fake, scruffy mustache that looked a little bit messy. They didn't want him to look like a cool spy, they wanted him to look like someone who works hard all day and is tired. When they were finished with his face, they changed his clothes, too. They took away his comfortable jeans and gave him a loose, cheap mechanic's uniform. The shirt was a little too big, and the boots were heavy and worn. Keanu looked in the mirror and barely recognized himself. The famous actor was gone. Staring back at him was a man named Steve. Steve looked like a regular guy you might see fixing a car or working at a hardware store. He looked invisible. Keanu smiled at his reflection, testing out the new face. It felt strange, but also freeing. For the first time in years, he could walk down the street and nobody would look at him twice. Before he left the trailer, the producer went over the plan one last time. They were going to a local barber shop. It was a real place with real customers, not actors. Keanu was going to pose as a new trainee barber. His job would be to sweep the floor, clean up hair, and hand out towels. He wasn't allowed to cut anyone's hair, obviously, but he had to act like he worked there. He had to be polite, do what he was told, and try to talk to people without breaking character. If anyone found out who he was, the experiment was over. Keanu took a deep breath. He put on a cap to cover his hair and stepped out of the trailer into the bright sunlight. A camera car was parked down the street to film everything secretly, but from a distance, it just looked like a guy walking to work. As he walked toward the barber shop, his heart was beating a little fast. He wasn't nervous about performing. He has done thousands of takes in movies. He was nervous about the unknown. He was about to step into a world where he wasn't the most important person in the room. When he pushed open the glass door of the barber shop, a little bell rang above him. The smell of talcum powder and hair tonic hit him immediately. Inside, it was loud. There were televisions playing sports, and the sound of clippers buzzing filled the air. A few barbers were working on customers, and a few people were waiting in plastic chairs. No one even looked up when Keanu walked in. In his mechanic's uniform, with his fake mustache and tired posture, he was just part of the background. The manager of the shop, an older man with a thick beard, came over to him. He was in on the secret, but he played his part perfectly. He looked Keanu up and down with a grumpy expression. "You're the new guy?" the manager asked roughly. Keanu nodded, lowering his eyes a bit to stay in character. "Yes, sir." "Ready to work?" "All right," the manager grunted, pointing to a broom in the corner. "Start sweeping. Keep the floor clean. And don't get in the way." Keanu nodded again and grabbed the broom. He started to sweep the piles of hair from the floor. It was hard work. The hair was fine and stuck to everything. As he worked, he listened to the conversations happening around him. Two men in the waiting chairs were arguing about football. A barber was complaining about the price of gas. It was normal, everyday life. Keanu felt a strange sense of peace. He was just a guy with a broom, listening to the world go by. For a moment, he forgot he was a movie star. He was just Steve, trying to do a good job. He moved carefully around the chairs, making sure not to bump into the customers or the barbers. When he made eye contact with someone, he gave a small, shy smile. Most people just looked away or ignored him. They were there for a haircut, not to talk to the cleaner. This was exactly what Keanu wanted. He was seeing the world from a different perspective. He realized that when you have no status, people really don't pay much attention to you. You become invisible. However, Keanu also knew that invisibility can make you vulnerable. Without his fame to protect him, he was just a stranger in a room full of strangers. He had to be careful. He watched the dynamics of the shop. He saw who the regulars were and who held the power in the room. It was interesting to watch. He noticed a group of men near the door who were talking loudly and laughing. They seemed to know each other well, and they seemed to enjoy being the center of attention. Keanu kept sweeping, moving closer to their area. He wanted to hear what they were saying, just to feel part of the group. But as he got closer, the atmosphere began to change. One of the men in the group stopped talking and looked directly at Keanu. The man was big, wearing a leather vest, with tattoos on his arms. He watched Keanu sweep for a moment, and there was no friendliness in his eyes. Keanu felt a prickle on the back of his neck. The experiment was working, maybe a little too well. He was no longer just invisible, he had become a target. Keanu continued to sweep the floor, moving from one corner of the shop to the other. The rhythm of the broom against the linoleum was almost hypnotic. Swoosh, swoosh, crack. The bristles caught on the dried hair and the small bits of paper that littered the ground. He was careful, meticulous in a way that maybe a regular janitor wouldn't be. After all, this was the man who spent months training for movies like The Matrix. He didn't know how to do things halfway. Even if he was just playing a character named Steve, Steve was going to be the best floor sweeper this barber shop had ever seen. As he worked, Keanu tried to listen to the stories floating around the room. This was the part he had been looking forward to the most, the real human connection. In his everyday life, people only talked to him about movies, or money, or fame. They put on a mask when they were around him. But here, in this dusty shop filled with the smell of shaving cream and old leather, he was just part of the furniture. He heard two older men debating about the price of tomatoes at the grocery store. He listened to a young barber complaining about his landlord. These were the small, unimportant details of real life, and Keanu found it fascinating. It grounded him. It reminded him that the world keeps turning even when the cameras aren't rolling. He moved toward the waiting area, which was a row of cheap red chairs bolted to the floor. A younger guy was sitting there, scrolling through his phone, looking bored. Keanu saw an opportunity to actually interact. He leaned the broom against the wall for a second and walked over to a small mini fridge in the corner. He grabbed a can of soda. "Thirsty?" Keanu asked, his voice a little quieter than his normal speaking voice. He was trying to sound tired, like he had been on his feet all day. The young guy looked up, startled. He took the can with a nod. "Yeah, thanks. It's taking forever in here." Keanu smiled, that familiar, crooked smile, but hidden under the fake mustache it just looked like a friendly, awkward grin. "Busy day," he said simply. The guy didn't recognize him. Why would he? To the customer, this was just a tired older man in a baggy uniform handing him a drink. "You new here?" the guy asked, cracking the tab on the soda. "Yeah," Keanu replied, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "First day. Just trying to stay out of trouble." "Well, good luck with that," the customer said, turning back to his phone. Keanu walked back to his broom, feeling a small spark of joy. It was a tiny interaction, meaningless in the grand scheme of things, but it felt real. The guy didn't want anything from him. He didn't want a selfie. He just accepted the soda and went back to his day. For Keanu, this was a victory. He was successfully blending in. He was Steve, the helpful worker. But the calm atmosphere didn't last long. The bell above the door chimed again, louder this time as it was pushed open aggressively. A group of 3 men walked in. They didn't walk in like normal customers, they marched in like they owned the place. The energy in the room shifted instantly. The barber who was cutting hair stopped talking. The young man with the soda put his phone down and looked nervous. Keanu felt it too. He stopped sweeping and stood near the back wall, watching. These men were loud. Their voices boomed against the tiled walls. They were dressed in rough clothes, jeans, heavy boots, and jackets with logos on the back. They were clearly regulars, or maybe people who just used the shop as a place to hang out and intimidate others. One of the men, the biggest one in the group, walked up to the counter and slapped his hand down on it. "Hey!" he shouted to the manager. "Who's taking care of us? We've been waiting, like, 5 minutes outside." The manager, a tough guy himself but clearly smart enough to avoid a fight, stepped forward. "Just take a seat, guys. We'll get you sorted in a minute." The big man didn't like that answer. He grumbled something under his breath and turned around to look at the seating area. That's when his eyes landed on Keanu. Keanu was holding the broom, standing near a pile of swept-up hair. He tried to look busy, hoping to avoid eye contact. But in a small room like this, it's hard to hide. The big man stared at him. He looked at the fake mustache, the baggy uniform, and the way Keanu was trying to make himself small. He saw someone he could push around. "What is this?" the big man asked, pointing a thick finger at Keanu. He looked back at his friends. "Since when do we have a janitor sweeping while we wait? This place is getting crowded." His friends laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh, it was the kind of laugh that bullies do when they sense weakness. "Maybe he's cleaning up your mess, Bill," one of them joked. Keanu stayed quiet. He tightened his grip on the broom handle but kept his body language relaxed. He had been in situations like this in movies, but this was different. There was no script. There was no director to yell cut if things got too heavy. He had to handle this as Steve. "Just doing my job, sir," Keanu said softly. He kept his head down, focusing on the floor. The big man, Bill, walked over to him. He invaded Keanu's personal space, standing way too close. He wanted a reaction. He wanted to see if this old guy would get scared. "Your job is in the way," Bill said, bumping his shoulder against Keanu's. Keanu didn't move. He planted his feet. He didn't fight back, but he didn't step aside either. He just stood there, solid as a rock. "I'll be done in a minute," Keanu said, his voice steady. "Then you'll have plenty of room." The shop went quiet. The buzzing of the clippers seemed to get louder in the silence. Everyone was watching now. The tension in the air was thick, like a storm cloud ready to burst. Keanu could feel the adrenaline starting to pump through his veins. This was exactly what he didn't want, but it was exactly what he had risked happening. He was being treated not like a star, but like a nuisance. And the worst part was, he knew it was only going to get worse. The men were bored, and they had found their target for the afternoon. The friendly disguise of Steve had worked too well. It had made him look weak. Bill sneered, looking Keanu up and down one more time, trying to find a crack in the armor. He didn't know he was messing with John Wick. He just thought he was messing with a guy with a broom. "Make it fast," Bill spat on the ground near Keanu's boot. "I don't like people hovering around me." Keanu looked up then. For a split second, his eyes locked with Bill's. There was a depth in those eyes that made Bill hesitate, just for a moment. A flash of something dangerous and commanding. But then Keanu blinked, and the moment was gone. He went back to sweeping, moving the pile of hair into the dustpan. "Sure thing," Keanu said, his voice calm again. The interaction settled for a moment, but the seed had been planted. The group of men sat down, but they kept looking back at Keanu, whispering to each other and laughing. They were sharks that had smelled blood. Keanu continued to work, but the simple joy of the experiment was fading. Now, it was a test of character. He had to endure the disrespect without revealing who he was. He had to take it, just like anyone else in his position would have to. He realized that this was the dark side of anonymity. When people don't know who you are, they don't have to be nice. And for Keanu, that was a lesson much harder to learn than any fight choreography. The air in the barber shop felt heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. Even though the sun was shining outside, the mood inside had turned dark and uncomfortable. Keanu could feel the eyes of the bullies burning into his back. Every time he moved the broom, he felt watched, judged, and mocked. It was a strange feeling for him. He is used to being looked at, of course, but usually, people look at him with love, admiration, or excitement. This was different. This was a look of contempt. They looked at him like he was nothing, like he was a piece of trash on the floor that needed to be swept away. He tried to focus on his work. He moved to the next row of chairs, crouching down to pick up some hair that had fallen under a seat. He kept his head low, hoping that if he stayed quiet and invisible, they would get bored and leave him alone. But that was not going to happen. The group of men, led by the big guy in the leather vest, seemed to feed on the tension. They weren't there for haircuts, they were there to dominate the room. And Keanu, the quiet new guy in the baggy uniform, was the easiest target they could find. Keanu stood up and walked toward the dustbin to empty his dustpan. He had to walk right past the group. As he got close, one of the younger men in the group stuck his foot out just a little bit. It wasn't a full trip, just enough of an obstacle to make Keanu stumble if he wasn't careful. Keanu saw it out of the corner of his eye. Years of training for action movies had given him incredible reflexes. He could have easily jumped over it, or he could have stepped around it gracefully. But Steve wasn't a ninja. Steve was a clumsy mechanic. So, Keanu pretended to trip. He shuffled his feet, caught himself on the edge of a chair, and nearly dropped the dustpan. The group erupted in laughter. "Whoa, easy there, Grandpa!" one of them shouted. "Watch where you're going." Keanu straightened up, his face flushing red with embarrassment, or at least, he pretended it was embarrassment. In reality, he felt a surge of anger. It was a sharp, hot feeling in his chest. It wasn't fair. He was just trying to do a job he didn't even have, and these guys were being cruel for no reason. But he knew he couldn't fight back. If he fought back, it would ruin everything. If he used his real strength or voice, the game would be over. So, he swallowed his pride. "Sorry," Keanu mumbled, looking down at his boots. "My bad." "Sorry," the big leader chimed in, his voice dripping with mockery. He stood up from his chair, crossing his arms over his wide chest. He towered over Keanu. "You're bumping into customers now. This is a barber shop, not a playground. Maybe you should stick to the back room where you belong." The other men snickered, nudging each other with their elbows. The shop was deadly silent otherwise. The barber cutting hair stopped his clippers, but didn't turn around. The young man with the soda stared at his phone intensely, wishing he could disappear. Everyone knew that things were getting out of hand, but no one wanted to be the hero. No one wanted to stand up to the bullies. Keanu looked at the leader. He saw the cruelty in the man's eyes. He saw a man who enjoyed making others feel small. For a second, Keanu let his guard down. He looked the man directly in the eyes, and for a brief moment, the intensity of his gaze cut through the disguise. It was the look of a man who has faced incredible loss and survived, a look of a man who knows his own worth. But the leader was too arrogant to notice it. He just saw an old man staring at him. "I said, I'm sorry," Keanu said, a little louder this time. "I'll be more careful." The leader stepped closer, getting right into Keanu's face. He was close enough that Keanu could smell the stale tobacco on his breath. "You think saying sorry fixes everything?" the man growled. "You don't belong here. We come here to relax, not to watch some old guy trip over his own feet. Why don't you take a hike?" It was the phrase "you don't belong here" that hit Keanu the hardest. It was such a simple sentence, but it carried so much weight. It is something that almost everyone fears hearing at some point in their lives. It is the fear of rejection, the fear of being an outsider. Keanu had traveled the world, lived in mansions, and walked on red carpets, but in that moment, dressed as Steve, he felt the sting of rejection just as sharply as anyone else. He felt small. He felt unwelcome. The words hung in the air. "You don't belong here." The shop seemed to shrink around them. The walls felt closer. The ticking clock on the wall sounded like a hammer. The other barbers were watching now, their eyes wide with concern. They were waiting to see what would happen next. Would Keanu snap? Would he yell back? Would he cry? Keanu took a deep breath. He could feel his hands shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the effort of holding back his true self. Every instinct he had told him to stand up tall and tell this guy off. He wanted to say, "You have no idea who I am." He wanted to use his fame to shut them down. But he stopped himself. That would be cheating. That would be using power to overpower the weak. Real strength wasn't about being the biggest star in the room, real strength was about taking the high road. So, Keanu did something unexpected. He didn't argue. He didn't get angry. He just nodded slowly, accepting the man's judgment. "You're right," Keanu said softly. "I'll move to the back." He turned away and walked toward the back of the shop, toward the break room. It felt like a defeat. He felt his shoulders slump forward. He felt the weight of the costume pressing down on him. He was acting, yes, but the emotions were real. It is a terrible feeling to be pushed around and to have no choice but to take it. He was experiencing what millions of people go through every day in jobs all over the world. He was realizing that kindness and quietness are often mistaken for weakness. As he walked away, the leader let out a loud scoff. "Yeah, you better run," he shouted at Keanu's back. The laughter started up again, louder and meaner than before. They felt like they had won. They had chased away the weird guy. Keanu reached the doorway of the back room and paused. He leaned against the door frame for a second, out of sight of the main shop. He closed his eyes and exhaled a long, shaky breath. He needed a moment to reset. He needed to find that center of calm again. He reminded himself why he was doing this. He wanted to understand the human experience. Well, this was certainly part of it. Rejection and humiliation. He could hear them still laughing out front. They were feeling powerful now. But Keanu knew that their power was fake. It was built on making others feel bad. True power, he thought to himself, is being kind when people are cruel to you. It is staying calm when the world is chaotic. He opened his eyes and the sadness was gone, replaced by a look of quiet determination. He wasn't going to leave. He wasn't going to let them win. He adjusted his fake mustache and straightened his uniform. He was still Steve. But Steve was made of tougher stuff than they realized. He grabbed a bottle of glass cleaner and a rag from the shelf inside the back room. It was time to go back out. He wasn't going to go out there looking for a fight, but he wasn't going to hide either. He had a job to do, and he was going to do it with dignity, no matter what they said. He took one last breath, squared his shoulders, and walked back into the lion's den. Keanu walked back into the main area of the shop holding a spray bottle and a rag. He didn't look at his feet anymore. He didn't look like a beaten dog walking away with its tail between its legs. He stood up straight, his shoulders back. The silence in the room was heavy as he moved past the waiting chairs. The rude men were still watching him, expecting him to stay in the back, perhaps feeling proud that they had chased him away. But here he was, coming back into their space. He walked directly over to the large mirror that ran along the wall, right next to where the leader of the group was sitting. The mirror was smudged with fingerprints and hair product. It was a small job, but it put Keanu right in the lion's den. He stood next to the man who had just humiliated him and started spraying the glass. The hiss of the spray bottle was the only sound for a moment. The leader turned his head, his face twisting into a scowl. "I thought I told you to beat it," he growled, his voice low and threatening. "You're asking for it, pal." Keanu didn't stop wiping the glass. He moved the rag in slow, steady circles. He didn't look at the man directly, but he also didn't cower. "Just doing my job, sir," Keanu said. His voice was different now. It wasn't shaky or fearful. It was calm. Very calm. Too calm. The man seemed confused by this reaction. Usually, when people picked on someone, that person would either get angry or run away. Keanu was doing neither. He was just There. Unshakable. It made the bully feel like he was losing control of the situation. He hated that. "I don't care about your job," the man snapped, leaning forward. He poked Keanu hard in the shoulder with a thick finger. "Get away from me. You're creeping me out with that staring act." Keanu stopped wiping. He slowly turned his head. This time, he didn't look away. He looked right into the bully's eyes. It was a gaze that felt strangely heavy. It was the kind of look that makes you rethink your choices. In that split second, the man saw something in Steve's eyes that he couldn't explain. It was a look of immense patience, but also a warning. It was the look of a man who has seen things this bully couldn't even imagine. "I am not staring," Keanu said quietly. "I am just looking at you. And I am asking you nicely to stop touching me." The shop froze. The barber cutting hair paused with the scissors in mid-air. The customers in the waiting chairs stopped looking at their phones. Even the bully's friends stopped laughing. Nobody spoke to the leader like that. Nobody told him to stop touching them. The leader's face turned bright red. His ego was bruised. He felt disrespected in front of his friends. He stood up quickly, knocking his chair backward. It hit the floor with a loud bang. He stepped chest to chest with Keanu, trying to use his size to intimidate him. The man was half a foot taller and much wider than Keanu. "Who do you think you are?" the man shouted, spit flying from his mouth. "Do you want to get hurt? Do you think you're tough?" Keanu didn't move an inch. He didn't flinch. He didn't raise his hands to fight. He just stood there, breathing slowly and evenly. He looked like a statue. Inside, Keanu's mind was clear. He wasn't afraid of a fight. He had been in hundreds of fake fights on camera. But he knew that in real life, fighting solves nothing. Real strength is control. He was controlling the urge to defend himself physically. Instead, he used the silence. He stared at the man. He didn't say a word. He just watched him, waiting for the man to run out of steam. The silence stretched out. 3 seconds. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. It felt like an eternity. The man was shouting, but Keanu was a void that swallowed the noise. "You're nothing," the man yelled, his voice cracking slightly because Keanu wasn't reacting. "You're a nobody. You're a loser with a broom." Keanu tilted his head slightly to the side. It was a very small movement, but it was full of meaning. It was a look of pity. He looked at the angry man not with fear, but with sadness. He looked at him like a parent looks at a child throwing a tantrum. That look hit the bully harder than any punch could have. It stripped away his power. "Are you done?" Keanu asked softly. It wasn't a sarcastic question. It was a genuine question. The man opened his mouth to yell again, but the words got stuck in his throat. He looked into Keanu's eyes and suddenly felt a chill run down his spine. There was something dangerous about this Steve. The man realized, deep down, that if this guy wanted to fight, the big man would probably lose. But mostly, he felt foolish. He was screaming at a janitor in a barber shop. He looked like an idiot. The man's shoulders slumped. He took a step back. The anger seemed to drain out of him, replaced by confusion and embarrassment. He looked at his friends, but they were all looking at the floor, pretending not to notice what was happening. They didn't want to get involved anymore. The vibe had completely shifted. The predator had become the prey, not through violence, but through the sheer force of presence. "Just stay away from me," the man mumbled, grabbing his jacket. He looked shaken. He sat back down in his chair, but he was hunched over now, looking small. Keanu held his gaze for one more second, then nodded. He turned back to the mirror and finished cleaning the smudge. He sprayed the glass one last time and wiped it dry. It was perfectly clean now. The tension in the room began to dissolve. The barber started his clippers again. The TV in the corner seemed louder again. People let out breaths they didn't know they were holding. It was over. Keanu walked away from the mirror and went back to the center of the room. He felt different. He wasn't just acting anymore. He had stood his ground. He had proven to himself that he didn't need a movie script or a team of bodyguards to be strong. He just needed to be himself. Even disguised as someone else, his inner strength was still there. He looked over at the manager, who was watching from behind the counter. The manager had a look of shock on his face. He gave Keanu a small, respectful nod. He knew that most people would have run away or cried. Keanu had de-escalated the situation without throwing a single punch. It was a master class in handling bullies. Keanu picked up his broom again. He was just Steve again, the quiet worker. But everyone in the shop knew that something special had just happened. The air was clearer. The bullies were quiet. The peace had returned, not because the bullies left, but because they had been silenced by someone who refused to be broken. Keanu went back to sweeping, a small, satisfied smile hidden behind his fake mustache. He had won. The minutes ticked by in the shop, but the feeling in the room was completely different now. It was lighter, easier to breathe. The aggressive man who had shouted at Keanu was now sitting quietly in his chair, looking at his phone. He seemed like he was trying to disappear into himself. He didn't make eye contact with anyone, especially not with the quiet janitor in the corner. The friends who had laughed along with him were also silent. They were awkwardly shifting in their seats, looking at the magazines or the ceiling, pretending that the ugly scene from a few minutes ago had never happened. Keanu went back to sweeping the hair, moving with his slow, rhythmic pace. He wasn't pretending to be weak anymore, but he wasn't being aggressive either. He was just existing in the space, calm and steady. He had faced the storm and come out the other side without getting wet. He felt a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in a long time. It was the peace that comes from knowing exactly who you are, regardless of what anyone else says or does. He didn't need their respect, and he certainly didn't need their fear. He was just happy to be Steve, the guy who swept the floors. Suddenly, a voice boomed over a hidden speaker system in the shop. It was a voice that came from the ceiling, loud and clear, cutting through the sound of the buzzing clippers. Cut. That's a wrap, everyone. The sound was so sudden and so loud that everyone in the shop jumped. The barber pulling the cape off a customer froze. The young man in the waiting area dropped his phone. The aggressive bully looked up, his eyes wide with confusion, looking around for the source of the noise. What the heck was that? The leader of the group mumbled, looking annoyed again. Before anyone could figure out what was going on, the front door of the shop flew open. A team of people rushed in. They were holding cameras and microphones. They were wearing headsets and looking very busy. At the front of the group was the producer, the same man who had helped Keanu plan this whole day in the makeup trailer. The shop turned into chaos for a moment. Cameras were pointed at everyone's faces. Lights were turned on. The customers looked terrified and bewildered. They didn't know if this was a police raid or a TV prank. The producer walked straight to the center of the room and clapped his hands together. He had a huge smile on his face. "Okay, everyone, relax. "You are all part of a special show," he announced to the room. "We have been filming here today for a hidden camera experiment. And we have a very special guest with us." The barber shop patrons looked at each other, totally lost. "A special guest in this tiny shop?" The producer turned toward Keanu, who was standing by the broom. "Let's bring him out, guys," he yelled. Two makeup artists rushed over to Keanu. One of them reached up and started pulling at his face. Keanu stood still and let them work. In one swift motion, they peeled off the fake mustache that had been glued to his lip. Then, they pulled off the wig that covered his dark hair. They wiped away the spirit gum that held the prosthetics on his chin. The transformation happened in seconds. The tired skin of the mechanic vanished. The sagging jawline snapped back into place. The messy gray hair was gone. Standing there, in the cheap mechanic's uniform, was Keanu Reeves. The silence that fell over the room was absolute. It was the loudest silence you can imagine. The bully in the chair froze. His mouth fell open. He looked at the man standing in the middle of the room, then he looked at his friends, then back at Keanu. His brain was trying to process what his eyes were seeing. The quiet, weak old man who he had pushed around was actually one of the most famous action stars in the world. It was like a glitch in the Matrix. The young guy with the soda stood up, his eyes popping out of his head. "No way," he whispered, That's Neo." The barber looked like he was going to faint. He dropped his comb on the floor. Then, the realization really hit. The whole room exploded. It wasn't angry noise anymore, it was pure shock and excitement. The customers jumped out of their seats. The barber started laughing hysterically, a nervous, happy laugh. Everyone pulled out their phones instantly, wanting to capture this unbelievable moment. Keanu smiled his signature, humble smile. He didn't act like a big celebrity. He just looked like a guy who was happy the secret was out. He took a bow, laughing a little at the madness he had created. "Surprise," Keanu said, his voice back to its normal, deep tone. The room swarmed him. The customers wanted selfies. The barber wanted to shake his hand. But the most interesting moment was about to happen. The aggressive leader of the bully group was still sitting in his chair. He hadn't moved. He was pale white. He looked like he had seen a ghost. He was realizing that he had told Keanu Reeves he didn't belong here. He had pushed around John Wick. He had threatened the nicest guy in Hollywood. The humiliation must have been burning him alive. He tried to stand up to leave, to sneak out the back, but the crowd was too thick. He was trapped. Keanu saw him. Keanu has a reputation for being incredibly kind, for having a heart of gold. He could have ignored the guy. He could have laughed at him. He could have told the security to kick him out. That is what most people would do. But Keanu is not most people. He gently pushed through the crowd of people asking for photos and walked over to the bully. The room got quiet again, sensing the confrontation. The bully looked terrified. He thought Keanu was going to yell at him. Keanu stopped in front of the man and extended his hand. "Hey, man," Keanu said softly. "No hard feelings." The bully looked at Keanu's hand, then up at his face. He was shaking. I didn't know," he stammered. "I'm so sorry. I said those things. I didn't know it was you." Keanu laughed warmly. "I know. That was the point. You were doing your character, I was doing mine. We were both acting." The bully let out a breath he had been holding for a long time. The tension evaporated. He shook Keanu's hand, but he didn't squeeze it, he held it like it was made of gold. "You're a good guy," the bully said, looking like he might actually cry. "I feel terrible." "Don't," Keanu said, patting the man on the shoulder with his other hand. "It was a good lesson for me, too. Thanks for making it real." The crowd awed at the interaction. It was a perfect moment of forgiveness. It showed why the world loves Keanu Reeves. He didn't just teach the bully a lesson by revealing himself, he taught him a lesson about kindness by letting him off the hook. For the next hour, the barber shop was the coolest place on earth. Keanu took pictures with everyone. He swept the floor one last time for the cameras, laughing as he did it. He hugged the barber. He drank a free soda. He treated every single person in that room, from the young kid to the guy who was mean to him, with the exact same amount of respect. Eventually, it was time to go. Keanu waved goodbye and walked out the door, stepping back into the sunlight. He didn't get into a limousine. He just walked down the street with his team, leaving the shop buzzing with energy. As he walked away, he thought about what had happened. He had gone in looking for an experience, wanting to feel invisible. But he left feeling something else. He learned that people judge you by how you look, but they remember you by how you make them feel. For a few hours, he wasn't a billionaire. He was just Steve, the guy who didn't belong. And by being that guy, he had made a memory for those people that they would talk about for the rest of their lives. He wasn't just a movie star anymore. He was a legend, in the realest way possible.